Welcome to chapter 26, in which we are going to conquer the easy topic of gerunds. This is a video for WriteLatin.org using the Lingua Latina per se illustrata curriculum, and you can download this PowerPoint presentation in the video description. We're going to go over the origin of gerunds, which isn't very important, but just for those who care about it. Then we're going to do its connections, its formation and meaning. That's important. Usage, very important. In which we're going to learn the four causes and also the four meanings of gratia. Recap and then some practice at the end. First, the origin of gerunds. As long as you see this red box appear for the next 3.5 minutes, then you can kind of tune this out a little bit. It's not hugely important. It's just for those who are interested in it. Not now, but in chapter 31, we are going to get this new concept called the FPP, the future passive participle. And that is where gerunds originate from, where they come from. So just to go through this, we have our present participle, our past participle, our future active, and then we'll have the future passive participle up here. So this is coming in chapter 31, and this means about to be blanked. Not about to blank, but about to be blanked. So it's just like the future active, but it's got this be and ed in it. Now, obviously, this is future, and it is often used for purpose, because this is often used for all the little errands and chores that are going to have to be done by you in the future. Well, guess what? Today we're going to learn gerund. And what is a gerund? Well, it's basically an infinitive in another case. So when we do infinitives in other cases today, i.e. gerunds, then what you're going to see is that 90% of the time, gerunds are used to express purpose, futurishly. Now, technically, it's going to be a present infinitive, but every time you say to blank, doesn't that have a kind of a sense of futurishness? I want to blank. Yeah. So now you know that there is something else that is commonly already used to express purpose, which you're going to learn in chapter 31, which is FPPs, future passive participles. So our gerund form today in this chapter is really going to come from that form way off in chapter 31. So your book probably should have done these in reverse order and done the FPPs first, but I didn't pick the order of the topics. So let's see how our gerunds come from those FPPs, which you don't even know yet. Okay, well, the FPP is going to look like this. Don't worry about this too much. You're going to learn this again in the future. So it's going to look like vocandus or vocanda or vocandum. So that means to be called, and that's in any case, number, or gender. Now, what if this were neuter? Notice the balloon here is now also neuter. What would that mean? Well, that would mean a thing to be called. What sort of thing? Like the job to be called, or the concept itself to be calledness. So that is a really good description of purpose. So when we use a neuter FPP like this, that really conveys really well exactly what we want to say with the infinitive. Well, guess what? We're actually going to use it for the infinitive. Well, at least for the infinitive's other four oblique cases: genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative. So this neuter form here is exactly what we want for the infinitive's other cases. And it just so happened in the evolution of Latin that this neuter form started to be used for the other cases of the infinitive. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, what does he mean by other cases of the infinitive? Well, you're going to find out here in a couple slides. So before I introduce those other cases, I want to place all this in context. So you probably remember this slide back from chapter 22, where I compared the suffix ing in English, and we commented how this is expressed in 3 separate Latin constructions. So we had participles and infinitives, where the participle is an adjective and the infinitive is a noun. And then right here in chapter 22, we had a supine, which is also a noun really, an action concretized as a noun. And the difference between the infinitive and the supine was that the infinitive was just the concept of running, ideally, whereas the supine was an actual instance of running, really being imagined. So one was ideal and the other was real. That's where we were as of stage 22. Now we're going to add something more to this chart. In the middle column, the infinitive is going to get more forms. So let's represent this same chart again. And remember, we had all the forms of the participle right there. And from the PPP, we got all the forms of the supine here. And the big two, of course, were the middle two. But we had only one form of the infinitive up there. Just vocare for the concept of calling itself. Well, what if we could decline that infinitive, that concept of calling, and use it in other cases in the sentence? Oh, we can. And here's how. What we're going to do is we're going to use second declension neuter endings, and we're going to tack on some stem, which I haven't told you what it is yet. Now, wait a second. We need to stop this, because actually I told you something wrong right here. An instance of calling could be plural, because there could be multiple instances of calling. George is calling over there, Mary's calling over here, I'm calling on the spot. So there could be multi-vocatus, but could there be multiple concepts of calling? Multiple ideas of calling? Objectively, no. We might have different views of that concept of calling, seeing it from different perspectives with different qualities and connotations, but in general, there is just one concept of calling, and that's why we only have one word for it in the language. So really there is no plural, and this is what we're going to see in the gerund, that there are no plural forms for the gerund. So all this disappears. And this is all you got to worry about. Isn't this nice? Much easier now. Okay, so here are the forms, and you can probably guess what they're going to be based on what the FPP was a few slides ago. Take a guess. ND is the sign of the gerund. Now normally I make that ND blue to signify futureness, and it will be blue in chapter 31 when we're using it as a future passive participle. But here where it's a gerund, notice it's green. And the reason I do that is because the gerund is technically present tense, not future tense, but present, and green for me is the color of present tense. So this sign, ND, signifies two separate things. One is the gerund, which you're learning now, and the other is going to be the future passive participle, which you'll learn later. So just take note that the second principal part gives us two of the Latin ing constructions, and the fourth principal part over there, the PPP, gives us the other Latin ing construction. All right, so just wanted you to notice that. All right, so now let's go through Okay, so this is what the gerund is going to look like, and it means the concept of calling itself. So, of the idea of calling, to or for the idea of calling, or by, with, from the idea of calling is the way you would translate these. And so let's do a little housekeeping. Now, in the middle, you have not just the infinitive, currere est bonum, to run is good, but now also the gerund, vivendo. To run is good for living, for the concept of living. So basically, these are the same thing. Infinitives are gerunds. It's just one is nominative and the other is genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative. So, review. What did I say that gerunds are mainly about expressing? Remember, purpose. Get that into your mind. Gerunds are almost always, 90% of the time, used to express purpose. I'm just going to review that every so often. Okay, so a little more housekeeping. Now in our chart of infinitives, we have had 5 infinitives so far, but in the present active, we're going to have to add in the gerund as its other declined cases. All right, so formation and meaning. So how are you going to make this? Well, it's really simple. Remember how back in chapter 14 with the present active participle, you had one rule for first conjugation, long ANS, and you had another rule for all the other conjugations, long ENS. And of course, you weren't supposed to forget the I as the sign of the conjugation, or here nothing if it's the nothing conjugation. But basically, it was just A or E. Well, that's exactly what we're going to do here with gerunds. So I can just tack on the gerund sign right over top of the PRAP sign and nothing changed. So you're going to make your gerunds exactly the same way you made your PRAPs. It's just AND or END. Simple. And of course, to the end of this, we're going to tack on the 4 possible endings. So the rule then at the bottom then is AND in A verbs, END everywhere else. All right, usage. All right, so now we're going to go through all 4 of these cases, starting with the genitive. So you can see here that there are huge numbers of words that could introduce the genitive gerund. So a cause of calling, the grace of calling, an act of calling, a case or instance of calling, a saying of calling, the effect of calling, the choice of calling, the outcome of calling, deeds of calling, the habit of calling, the understanding of what calling is, talk of calling, a demand of calling, a process of calling, the return of calling, a state of calling, a lifestyle of calling, a story of calling, the freedom of calling, the praise of calling, the art of calling, the lust of calling, the narrative of calling, the sound of calling, the game of calling, the more talk of calling, the love of calling, the shame of calling, the clamor of calling, the work of calling, the clatter of calling, the gift of calling, the office of calling, the promise of calling, the response of calling, the work of calling, the time of calling. And for the last one, of course, time of calling could be a whole bunch of other ones, like the year of calling, the month of calling, the hour of calling, the night of calling, the beginning of calling, the age or century of calling. All those are kinds of tempora. So you have just vastly increased your ability to talk about abstract concepts in Latin. But what I want you to focus on is the top 2 at the top left. These are the most common ones 90% of the time. When you see a genitive gerund, it will be after one of these 2 words, causa or gratia. And even more than that, it's going to be an ablative causa or an ablative gratia. And when you see that ablative causa or ablative gratia, you should think that it means for the sake of. Literally by or with or from the sake of, but we would say in English for the sake of. So when you see this, this is kind of making calling here to be the end or goal or final purpose that some other action is going on for. So for instance, kuro causa vocandi, I run for the sake of calling. So for example, os aperio, I open my mouth, causa vocandi, for the sake of calling. So calling is now the secondary purpose or goal. Now let's do a little digression so you understand this. Second word, gratia, a little better. Okay, so this word gratia is rather confusing to students. So I want to do a digression, and I want to point out to you the various meanings of gratia and how they are connected so that you will have this word straight in your mind. So causa and gratia are basically synonyms. They both mean identically the same thing. Causa is by cause, from which we get what English word? Because, right. And gratia is by the grace or by the pleasure, or we would say for the sake of, which basically means the same thing. That's the literal translation. So you might be thinking to yourself, gratia means for the sake of? Yeah, that's right. And here's how. Gratia comes from this adjective gratis, which means welcome or pleasing. So this is where we get our English word that something is gratifying to you. That means it is pleasing to you. So maybe like chocolate is gratifying to you. Okay, so from this word comes gratia. And gratia is that quality inside the gratifying thing that makes it be gratifying or pleasant or charming or attractive. That's what gratia is. It's the twinkle in the eye, the charmingness of it, the kernel or the inner magic or the inner goodness, the gratia. Okay, so this is where we get our English word graceful. Like when we say the skater was graceful, means that she was pleasant in your eyes, or maybe she was charming. So now you see we've got gratifying and graceful coming from this grat root. And you can understand this concept of pleasantness, gratia, by simply recalling that the Romans personified them as the three graces, euphrosyne, or cheerfulness, aglaia, or glamour, or thalia, for blossoming and abundance. So this was the way that the Romans thought of gratia. That's what it represented to them. Cheerfulness, glamour, sparkle in the eye. And in fact, the plural gratiae is identically the word for graces over there. Okay, so now we've got two pretty well distinct meanings on our word tree. Before we go on, I should cover where the Greek form, charis and caritas, comes from. Like, that's the same as our English word charity, but it comes from the Greek word joy, chara. So the word charity is kind of also on this word tree. Oftentimes people will speak of divine grace as being identically divine charity in the soul. So there's not much difference between these ideas. A second meaning of gratia is thanks, and we often see it in plural. Gratias tibi ago. I do to you, tibi, gratias, thanks. And you might ask yourself, what are you actually saying when you say that? Well, what you're saying is that when they give you a gift, the present, then what you give back to them is kind of like this intangible quality of pleasingness, that from now on they will be pleasing in your eyes because they gave you this gift. You can also kind of think of it as a ticket to your friendship, as an invitation or right to enter into your presence and be seen as good. You're bestowing on them this immaterial value of gratias in exchange for the tangible thing that they did for you. Okay, so from that comes a third meaning of gratias, and this one is only when it's ablative. It could mean not just a quality in a person, but a quality in the actual action. See how the rosiness moves out of the person into the external world, into the action that is waiting for them to perform it. So before it was pleasantness in a person, now it's pleasantness in the doing. It's a pleasantness that makes the action pleasing to do, attractive, easy. So gratia becomes this pulling power that is irresistibly drawing you to something. And what case is this? So the way we would translate this is by grace of the doing it, or we might say better, by the pleasantness of doing it. But the more Englishy way to say it would be for the sake of doing it. And when I say this, I'm thinking of that action as a final purpose. So I'm doing X now, gratia vocandi, for the sake of calling later. You could even think of it not just as a purpose, but as a motive, pulling you to it. So the philosophical term for that is a final cause, something that is attracting you, and by the sheer imagined pleasure of it, is drawing you to it. That's also part of the connotation of gratia. Now, in Christian times, this will become the dominant meaning, and they won't even use ablative anymore. When they say gratia, they mean grace, and by that they mean an attractive power that God puts into the action over there to make it attractive to you, to make you want to do it, and therefore to make it easy and pleasant for you. So God might give you grace to confess your sins by making the normally repugnant idea of calling yourself a sinner actually be attractive to you. Whoa, that's a thought. So it's kind of like you now have a ticket or an invitation to go do that action. That's the Christian idea of grace. But we're not going to deal with that so much because we're mainly focusing on the three classical meanings of gratia, not the fourth one, which is grace. So the three meanings that I want you to learn are pleasantness, thanks, and if it's ablative, for the sake of. You don't really need to know grace, but some of you who are going to go into theology or philosophy would want to know that one too. So, all that for one little word, gratia. Okay, let's do a little housekeeping. These are all a mess, but we can group them into common meanings. So far we've gotten just a final cause, which is the purpose or goal or motivator of action. Now, we're going to get three other causes, so you won't understand this at first, but just pay attention for a moment and bear with me. Okay, there's another cause called a formal cause. For instance, the act, art, game, or deeds of calling. The formal cause is kind of like the calling itself. It's the quality or the shape that that phenomenon takes. Another one down here is the efficient cause. That's the spark or doer that sets it into motion or sets it into existence. A final one is the material cause. That's what it's made out of, either actual material, or if it's an idea, it's made out of a set of circumstances or a certain situation, the setting in which that idea occurs. Okay, and these four Aristotelian causes, which means they came from Aristotle, apply to anything that exists, anything that you can possibly imagine. I don't care if it's a thing, an action, an idea, a person. You can identify these four causes for anything. And so is it at all surprising that these highly general categories of causality would introduce the genitive gerund vocandi? Not at all. But so that you will understand these just a little bit better, I would like to take a little of your time and do a second digression and demonstrate these four causes so that you will have a better grip on them and be able perhaps to apply them to analyzing the causality in other things in your life. Okay, so since these four causes commonly introduced gerunds, let's go through an example using an actual gerund. In this case, jactandi, of shooting. So the material cause is what it's made out of. Well, what is shooting made out of? Materially, it's made out of the iron in the soil, making the cannonball, maybe some other stuff too. It's also made out of the whole surrounding circumstance, maybe a battle somewhere. The efficient cause is the spark or doer that sets the shooting into motion. So it would be either the chemical energy in the torch or in the man's hand. It could also be in the gunpowder's chemical energy, which explodes, and that really gets the cannonball moving. So all these are efficient causes. Many times we often speak of God as the efficient cause of everything, because this word efficient comes from the Latin word efficere, to effect or make out of whatever material you started with, or in God's case, to make it out of absolutely nothing. Additionally, the formal cause is the form, the quality, or in this case, shape that the shooting takes. So you can see how it's plotted across the graph paper. And lastly, the final cause is the target or goal. And in a certain sense, you could speak of the whole act of shooting as being the goal. Why? Because the man wouldn't act unless he had the goal of wishing to shoot. Now, secondarily, he wants to shoot one place rather than another, but initially he just wants to shoot it all. So, in a certain sense, the whole thing is the final cause, but also the particular object of the shooting, that target over there, is more properly the final cause. Okay, once these four causes come together, suddenly the thing can come to be and exist, or in this case, happen. So, bang. Why? Because all four causes were there. The shooting would not have happened if any one of them was absent. If there was no material, there wouldn't be anything to shoot with. If there was no efficient cause, it would all just sit there, but the fuse wouldn't get lit. If there was no formal cause, then there would be a massive big explosion, and maybe the cannon would blow up, but it wouldn't shoot, because the formal cause of shooting is identically shooting itself. And lastly, final cause. If there isn't a point to something, why did it happen at all? So if there was no final cause, then none of the other three would even get going to begin with, because everything has to have a reason for its existence. Things just don't pop out of the blue for no reason. There is a meaning for everything in the universe. You can look at the stuff around you, the air. What is the reason for the air's existence? You could say, oh, well, it's just a quirk of the half-lives of the various elements, creating oxygen and nitrogen, and how they stuck together, and in the quirks of chemistry. But what's the reason for chemistry? Well, because there's fundamental constants that create our whole periodic table. Well, what's the reason for the fundamental constants? I don't know. Someone picked them. Who picked them? So everything was put there for a reason. Even things that we think are sheer chance and happenstance were at least intended generally. Maybe not specifically, but generally. And this is no more true than in human intentionality. Anytime you've got an intention, oh boy, you've got a final cause for sure. Now, which one of these four do you think is most important that I want you to concentrate on? Right, it's the final cause. Because as I said, 90% of the time that you see a gerund, it's going to be one of your two final cause words, either causa in the ablative or gratia in the ablative. Causa jactandi for the sake of shooting, and gratia jactandi for the sake of shooting. Now, of course, it could be any of the other three as well. For instance, labor jactandi, the work of shooting, or actus jactandi, the act of shooting, or even materia or circumstantiae jactandi, the matter or the circumstances of shooting. So jactandi can be appended to all four of these. And notice that all of them can be replaced by just the generic word causa. Because after all, didn't we show that all four of these are true causes? That if you didn't have one, you wouldn't get the shooting? Sure. So now you have a much better understanding of the classical four causes of Aristotle. And so hopefully when you run into something in life that has some cause to it, you will be able to look and notice that there often may be more than one avenue of causality causing that event to occur. For instance, if someone did something bad and knocked boiling water on their little brother, you could realize that fault and guilt ought to be applied to more than just the efficient cause, the person who knocked it off. It should also be applied to whom? Who else caused the bad result? The person who made the material cause, the circumstances, and maybe set the pot on the edge of the stove with a handle hanging out where it might get bumped. Or maybe the person who was boiling water in the first place and shouldn't have been doing it. Same thing goes with praise and merit. If you did something very good, realize that although you're the efficient cause, you're not the only person who deserves praise. Who provided the material that enabled you to succeed? Who pointed you in the right direction to make you want to succeed? Out in the final cause. So man is not an island. The bell doesn't just toll for you, it tolls for everyone. So again, these are the four causes of Aristotle, and they apply in every walk of life. philosophy, law, theology, and in the fields where they don't apply, it's not usually because they wouldn't be helpful. It's just because the people there don't know about them. So besides these 4 categories, we also have some other categories. We have states of calling, and notice these are all blue supines. The habitus vocandi, the status or casus, or victus vocandi. We have the effect of calling, the effectus or exitus. We have the gift or ability of calling, the electus, the postulatum, the libertas, the donum of vocandi. We have the process of calling, whether it's a going out, processus, or a going back, recessus. We have the report of calling, using all those words there, the understanding of calling, and we have the valuing of calling, whether it's a love, amor vocandi, or a shame of calling, pudor vocandi, or maybe something else like an hatred, odium vocandi. And then last of all, we have all our words again for the tempus vocandi. So there's many ways that you can introduce this genitive gerund, vocandi. What I want you to do is to pick one from each of these categories and then be able to say it back to me from memory. So when I give you one of these symbols here, I want you to be able, just from memory, to write at least one word from that category. Why am I doing this? Because these categories are so varied in life that if you can say at least one word from each of these categories, then you have vastly increased your ability to express ideas abstractly in Latin. So that's why I'm asking you to do this. I suggest you take the first one in each category, but if you wanted to take one of the lower ones, yeah, go ahead and do that. That's fine. I'll ask you later in the video to try that, so you might want to stop the video right now and attempt to memorize one word from each of these areas, and then start it again when you're ready to keep going. Okay, next we're going to do the gerund's dative case, and this is very rare, but where it does occur, it occurs mostly with the subjective infinitive. Now you might have forgotten what the subjective infinitive is. It looks like this, if you remember from chapter 10. And can you guess where we're going to put in this dative gerund? Right, of course, and right where the dative is. So when we do that, it's going to have the meaning for blanking. And that's going to make it the final cause, the goal, the purpose of the rest of the sentence. And notice, of course, over there all the neuter adjectives that can introduce it. Necessa, possibile, facile, difficile. Well, we're going to have even more than those 4. So let's do a sample sentence here. Spirare, to breathe. Necessa, possibile, dissimile, bonum est, vivendo. Is that thing for living. To breathe is necessary for living. Of course, without the to breathe, you could just have tempus est vivendo. It is time for living. Now that technically wouldn't be a subjective infinitive. That would be a more general, just dative of reference. But anyways, so one of these words, we'll start it off, and then you'll put in your dative gerund here. And that should work for any dative of respect, in most of the time a subjective infinitive. There will also be a double dative once in a while, like the soldiers were for guards for the living of Caesar. But that's kind of rare, so I'm not even going to do it. And then, of course, don't forget that instead of tempus, we could have all those other tempus replacement words. It is the century for living, the day for living, the hour for living, etc., etc. Then next is the accusative gerund, and this is very common. It is preceded by ad, and it means to blank. So again here, the gerund is playing the role of purpose. So I go unto the calling, or we would just say in English, I go to call. You could also say I go for calling, unto calling, toward the calling, whatever. And lastly, we've got the gerund's ablative case, like for instance, vocando moneo, by with or from calling, I warn. So here the calling is kind of the means, isn't it, to the warning, and the warning is the goal. So this is kind of the reverse. Here the gerund is not playing the role of purpose, though it almost always has. Here the gerund is playing the role of means. And in case you forgot, there are also several prepositions that could precede an ablative like this. Do you remember what those prepositions are? Right, sid space. Now, not all of sid space will work, so I've crossed several of them out. But the ones that do work are these four. So, in calling, I warn. About calling, I warn. Without calling, I warn. For calling, I warn. Any of those would work. And so just in case you forgot, though, gerunds are mainly about expressing what? Right, purpose. Right. All right, so let's codify what we've learned and bring it all together on one slide. So first, the genitive gerund can be preceded by what? Any one of these 12 categories of abstract nouns, many of which are supines. Next, the dative is preceded by what? Any one of these neuters, except for dies and hora, but other than that. Next, the accusative is preceded by what? Right, odd. And then lastly, the ablative could be preceded by nothing or optionally by what? Right, 4 of the sid space prepositions. And then also, in what constructions are they used? First, the genitive is used after any abstract concept. Good. And then next, the dative is used in what construction? In a dative of what? In a dative of reference, often inside a subjective infinitive. Good, okay. Then the accusative is used for what? Purpose, toward, direction, whatever. And then lastly, the ablative is used to signify what? Means, right. And it can, of course, be with those words. Okay, so that means that 3 of these 4 are going to occur at the end of the sentence to signify purpose, while the last one is going to be used at the start of the sentence to signify means to some other purpose. All right, so hopefully now you've got the big picture. Okay, so let's do a recap also of purpose in Latin. And there are 6 ways to express purpose in Latin, and we have had 5 of them so far. Most of them are gerunds of some sort. So let's see if you can list these just with a few clues from me. First example is currere, volo, or pulsum. And what construction is that in the gray box there? An infinitive. Just any old ordinary infinitive is one way to express purpose. Isn't wanting purposing? Yeah, sure it is. Isn't having power to do something also a kind of virtual purposing? Sure. So I want the so you could even say I want to purpose to run, or I am able to purpose to run. All of those would work. And the translation? We've said it already. I want or I'm able to run. That'll work. Next example. Exeo cursum. What construction is that in the gray box? Hopefully you can remember this is a supine, right? And how do we translate that? I go out a-running, or I go out a-run. And what goes here? What is assumed or implied here? Odd, to, right. Okay, next example. Curo causa. What Latin word finishes this? Vivendi, yes. And what construction is that? A gerund. And say the case too, a genitive gerund, right. That's another way to express purpose. And so how would we translate this? I run for the sake or for the cause, meaning a final cause, of living. All right, next example. Curraret bonum est, and then what comes next to finish the Latin sentence? Vivendo. Very good. And what construction is the second gray box there? Dative gerund. Good. All right. And the translation would be what? To run is good for living. Yeah. All right. Okay, next example. Curro ad. What comes next? Vivendum. Good. And the construction is an accusative gerund. And the translation is I run to live, or for living. Right. And then lastly, the sixth way to convey purpose in Latin is the most common, more common than all of these, and we're going to have to wait till chapter 27 to learn that one. So don't take this stuff too seriously. Although you've learned all this stuff really well, and that's great, this is comparatively minor in comparison to the other way coming in chapter 27. But it's good that you know everything, so give yourself a pat on the back and move on. And notice that out of all of these, all of them were nouns. And notice that out of all of these ways to express purpose, all of them were nouns, not adjectives. So how is that possible? How could nouns express purpose? Well, because they're abstract nouns concretizing an action. So they've got that action idea inside of them. Great. Practice. Let's see how well you've learned this. I want you to be able to express purpose in 5 separate ways, and here they are. Notice most of them are gerunds. So if you look at the left column here, all of these mean to run, but they're done in different ways. For instance, the first line is an infinitive. The second line is ad plus a supine. The third line is causa plus a genitive gerund. The fourth is just a dative gerund. And the fifth one is ad plus an accusative gerund. So I want you to be able to write it just like I have done, but with other words. So stop the video and try these, and then turn it back on when you're ready to see the answers for just this slide. And the answers. So hopefully you were able to get all that. And then in the third line here, what word could replace causa in all of these examples? Right, gratia. It's a synonym, means completely the same thing. Okay, and then here's one more slide of doing the same thing. However, on the far right over there, you notice that I have 2 irregular verbs. Now, you won't be able to do the supine of to be, but everything else you should be able to do. So stop the video and now try these, and then start it again when you're ready to see the answers. And the answers. Notice over there in the bottom right, ascendi, ascendo, ascendum. Medieval Latin will make a whole new verb out of that as the verb to ascend. And they'll say that, oh, that's what an essence does. So an existence exists, but an essence ascends. That's just kind of weird. But in classical times, it would just mean of being, to or for being, all that. Okay, so hopefully you were able to get this. And then lastly, in the third row here, what word could replace causa in all of these examples? Right, gratia. All right. And then let's see how well you were paying attention to the kind of metagrammatical concepts that were being thrown out there as you were watching this video. So stop the video and try these, and then turn it on again when you're ready to see the answers. And the answers? All right, hopefully you could get most of those, and we'll be able to get the rest if you ever see these questions again. The last thing I want you to do is see if you can do what I said earlier in the video. Can you say at least one Latin word for all of these categories which introduce the genitive gerund? So stop the video and write these down on a sheet of paper. And if you can't, then rewind the video back to about 31 minutes and take note of the categories that you missed. And that does it. Now you should be a total expert in handling any gerund that you could ever conceivably run into in Latin. Walete!